I'm Walter, 68 years old, and until yesterday morning I believed I still had a daughter. I was ironing a linen shirt for a wedding when my phone buzzed on the dresser. It was a text from her, Claire. Change of plans. You're not walking me down the aisle. Robert's father is doing it instead. It just feels right for the family. I set the iron down and read the words 4 times, waiting for them to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They never did. I didn't call her. I didn't text back so much as a single word. I hung the shirt back in the closet, took off my tie, and sat down at the kitchen table of the house I owned outright in the town where I'd lived my entire adult life. And I made a decision that would take me the rest of the week to finish carrying out. By Friday, the wedding venue had no caterer, no florist, no string quartet, and no down payment on record. By Friday, the tuition account I'd been quietly funding for 3 years had a zero balance. Before I go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever had a child try to erase you from your own family, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone in this. The morning had started like any other. I'd been up since 5:30, the way I always was, drinking my coffee black on the back porch and watching the light come up over the Kellerman's old barn across the road. I live outside a small town in central Ohio, in a farmhouse that's been in my late wife's family for 2 generations, though I'm the one who spent 30 years keeping the roof from caving in and the fields from going to seed. Ellen and I raised Claire in that house. We taught her to ride a bike in the gravel driveway. We sat up with her through chicken pox and heartbreak and a broken collarbone from a horse she wasn't supposed to be riding. And when Ellen died of ovarian cancer 11 years ago, it was just the 2 of us, Claire and me, learning how to be a family with 1 fewer chair at the table. I never remarried. People ask me why, especially in those first few years, and I never had a good answer beyond the fact that I didn't want to. I had a daughter to raise and a business to run, and somewhere in there I told myself that would be enough. For a long time, it was. Claire went off to college on a scholarship I was prouder of than almost anything else in my life. She got a good job in Columbus doing something with marketing I never fully understood. And 3 years ago, she brought home a young man named Robert Ashford III, which should have told me everything I needed to know right there, given that men who need a Roman numeral after their name rarely turn out to be men you'd want your daughter married to. Robert's family had money, the kind of old, quiet money that doesn't announce itself so much as it simply assumes the room already knows. His father, Robert Ashford Jr., owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 counties and sat on the board of the country club I'd never once set foot inside. His mother, Diane, had a way of looking at our farmhouse furniture like she was doing inventory for an estate sale. From the very first dinner, I understood that in their eyes, I was the rough edge on an otherwise polished acquisition. A widower farmer with dirt still under his fingernails, marrying his daughter up and out of a life they considered beneath the family name. What none of them knew, what Claire herself had never fully understood because I'd never wanted her to grow up chasing a number instead of a work ethic, was that the 200 acres behind our house sat on some of the most valuable mineral rights in the county, and that 8 years ago, long before natural gas prices climbed the way they did, I'd quietly leased those rights to an energy company for a deal that made me, by any reasonable definition, a wealthy man. I kept driving the same 12-year-old pickup truck. I kept wearing the same flannel shirts. I kept working the land because it was the only life I knew how to love. And I let the world assume that Walter Pierce was just a farmer scraping by, because that assumption had always kept people honest with me, or at least it had until Claire brought Robert home. The wedding planning had consumed the last year of my life in ways I hadn't fully admitted to myself until that morning with the iron in my hand. I'd paid the deposit on the venue, a restored barn about 40 minutes from us that Claire had fallen in love with the moment she saw it, because of course she had. It looked exactly like the kind of place a Pierce would get married, except with better lighting and a bar that served drinks with names I couldn't pronounce. I'd covered the caterer. I'd covered the florist, a woman in Columbus who charged more for centerpieces than I used to pay a farmhand for a full week's work. I had, 3 years earlier, quietly opened an account to help cover the last 2 years of Claire's graduate school tuition, because Robert's family made it very clear, in the polite, needling way wealthy people make things clear without ever saying them outright, that a woman with a master's degree reflected better on the family than one without. And every single dollar of it I gave gladly, because I believed, the way any father believes, that this was simply what love looked like when it had the means to express itself. I never once threw the money in Claire's face. I never once reminded her of what I'd done for her. I did it quietly, the way Ellen had taught me a real gift is supposed to be given, and I trusted that somewhere underneath the Ashford veneer she was slowly acquiring, my daughter still knew whose hands had actually built the life she was walking into. That trust took exactly one text message to shatter completely. Change of plans. You're not walking me down the aisle. Robert's father is doing it instead. It just feels right for the family. I read it standing in my bedroom with a hot iron 6 inches from my hand, and I remember distinctly that the first thing I felt wasn't rage. It was a kind of cold, clinical clarity, the same feeling I used to get standing in a field right before a frost, when you know exactly what's coming and there's nothing left to do but watch it happen and decide how you're going to respond once it has. Do you have any idea how long I'd been planning what I was going to say to her at the reception? Do you have any idea how many nights I'd lain awake rehearsing a toast that wouldn't embarrass either of us? That would tell her, in front of everyone, exactly what kind of woman her mother and I had raised her to be? I unplugged the iron. I hung the shirt back in the closet where it would stay for a long time. And I did not call her, because I understood, with a certainty that surprised even me, that there was nothing left to discuss. Claire hadn't asked my opinion. She hadn't called to explain, to apologize, to even pretend that this was a difficult decision for her. She had made a choice about who her family was, and she'd made it over text on a Tuesday morning, 4 days before the wedding, the same way you might cancel a dinner reservation. I sat down at the kitchen table where I'd eaten 10,000 breakfasts, where Ellen used to sit across from me doing the crossword, where Claire used to do her homework with her tongue poking out the corner of her mouth in concentration, and I opened my laptop. The first thing I did was call the venue. The event coordinator, a pleasant woman named Sherry, who I'd worked with for the better part of a year, picked up on the second ring, cheerful, already talking about the final head count for Saturday. I told her, calmly, that I needed to cancel the remaining balance and pull my deposit agreement, effective immediately, and that any further payments related to the Pierce Ashford wedding should be directed to whoever the family designated going forward, because it would no longer be me. She went quiet for a moment, then asked, carefully, if everything was all right. I told her everything was about to be, for the first time in a long time, and I thanked her for her professionalism over the past year and ended the call. Then I called the caterer, a man named Danny who'd catered every major event in that county for 2 decades and who I'd known since we were boys fishing the same creek. I told him the same thing. He didn't ask questions, because Danny understood the way small towns understand things, that when a man like me cancels 4 days before his own daughter's wedding, there's a story there he doesn't need to hear to respect. The florist took longer, because there were contracts involved, penalty clauses for late cancellation that I read through twice and paid without complaint, because I wanted no loose threads, nothing Robert's family's lawyer could later point to and claim I'd acted rashly or improperly. I have never once in my life done anything rashly. Everything I did that day, and every day after it, was done with the same deliberate patience I'd learned working land that doesn't forgive impatience, that punishes you for planting before the frost has truly broken. The tuition account was the hardest call, not because of the money, but because it was the last thread that still connected me, quietly, invisibly, to my daughter's future. I dialed the number for the university's bursar office and confirmed the final disbursement, the one scheduled to clear in 11 days that would have covered her final semester, and I withdrew my authorization as the account's guarantor. The woman on the phone explained gently that this would leave an outstanding balance that the student would need to resolve before the semester's registration could be finalized. I told her I understood completely, and I thanked her for her time. I want to be honest with you, the way I'd want a friend to be honest with me if our positions were reversed. There was a part of me, sitting at that table, that hoped Claire would call before the day was through. That some small measure of the girl who used to run to me crying over a broken toy would surface, would realize something had gone terribly wrong, and would want to understand why. That call never came. Instead, around 2 in the afternoon, my phone lit up with a group text, the kind sent to a dozen relatives at once, from Diane Ashford, informing everyone that due to a scheduling conflict, Walter Pierce would no longer be attending Saturday's ceremony, and that arrangements had been made to accommodate the change smoothly. A scheduling conflict, that was the sentence they'd chosen to erase me with, sent not to me, but around me, to my own family, as though I were an inconvenient vendor who double-booked himself, rather than a father being quietly written out of his only child's wedding. I sat with that message for a long time. I want you to understand something about grief, because that's what this was, even though nobody had died. Grief doesn't only come from loss of life. It comes from the loss of who you believed someone was. And sitting at that kitchen table, I grieved the daughter I thought I'd raised, because the woman sending that group text, or more accurately, allowing that group text to be sent on her behalf, was not the girl who used to fall asleep on my chest during Ohio State games, who used to write me notes and hide them in my lunch pail before school, who once told me at 9 years old, dead serious, that when she got married, I was the only person in the world she'd ever let walk her down that aisle. Because I was, in her words, her whole entire family. That night, I called my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Kowalski, who'd handled the mineral rights lease 8 years earlier and who I trusted with anything that mattered. I told her I needed to restructure my estate, effective immediately, and I needed it done quietly and completely. Patricia had known me long enough not to ask why over the phone. She simply asked when I could come into the office. I told her tomorrow morning, first thing, and she said she'd clear her calendar. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat in Ellen's old rocking chair on the porch, looking out over land that had fed 3 generations of Pierces, and I thought about every dollar I'd quietly funneled toward a wedding I was no longer welcome at, toward an education that would carry my daughter forward into a life that apparently no longer had room for me in it. I thought about the word family and how easily it had been used against me by people who had known me for 3 years to erase 32 years of a man who had never once, not for a single day, stopped showing up. The following morning, I drove into town before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. Patricia's office was above the old hardware store on Main Street, the kind of small-town law practice that handles wills and property disputes and, occasionally, situations exactly like mine. She had coffee waiting and a legal pad already covered in her tight, efficient handwriting. We spent 4 hours together. I told her everything, from the text message to the group text that followed it, and she listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do when they're already 3 steps ahead of you, already building the architecture of what needs to happen next. When I finished, she set down her pen and asked me one question. Walter, is this something you want to be reversible, or is this something you want to be final? I didn't hesitate. Final. We began with the trust. 3 years earlier, when Claire first brought Robert home, I had, out of an abundance of caution that I now recognized as instinct, I should have trusted more fully, set up a revocable living trust that named Claire as the primary beneficiary of both the mineral rights income and the farmhouse property, with the understanding that it would transfer to her fully upon my death. Patricia and I spent that morning restructuring it entirely. The farmhouse and the 200 acres beneath it would transfer instead to a charitable foundation I was establishing that day, one dedicated to funding agricultural scholarships for first-generation college students from farming families, students who, unlike my daughter, had nobody quietly padding their tuition account behind the scenes. The mineral rights income, going forward, would fund that foundation in perpetuity. Claire's name came off every document we touched. Patricia asked if I wanted to leave anything at all in place for her. A smaller account, some gesture that left the door open. I thought about it for a long moment, and then I told her about the 9-year-old girl who used to hide notes in my lunch pail, and I asked her to set aside a modest account, $25,000, held in trust and inaccessible for 5 years, not because I expected Claire to need it, but because some part of me, the part that was still her father underneath everything else, wasn't ready to slam every single door at once. Patricia didn't argue with me. She simply wrote it down. By early afternoon, we'd also drafted a formal letter on Patricia's letterhead to be sent to Claire directly rather than through any intermediary, informing her that as of that date, she had been removed as beneficiary of the Pierce Family Trust, that the previously arranged wedding expenses had been canceled at the source, and that any future financial support I had historically provided, including the tuition assistance, was terminated effective immediately. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. It contained no anger, no accusations, no mention of the text message or the group chat. Patricia had a gift for that kind of language, clean and final, and utterly without emotion, the kind of letter that says everything by saying almost nothing at all. I drove home that afternoon feeling something I hadn't expected to feel, which was not triumph, and not quite relief either, but a strange, heavy, quiet, the kind you feel after a storm has finally passed through and left the fields flattened in its wake. You stand there and survey the damage, and there's a kind of peace in simply knowing it's over, even when what's left behind doesn't look anything like what you'd hoped to keep. The wedding, as it turned out, did not go smoothly. I learned most of this secondhand, the way you learn things in a small town, through Danny at the fish fry that Friday night, and through my neighbor Carl, whose wife apparently still spoke with Diane Ashford at church. The venue, having been notified of the canceled contract, had rebooked the barn for another event entirely, leaving the Ashfords scrambling 4 days out to find an alternative space, which in rural Ohio in June is roughly as easy as finding a parking spot in Manhattan on a Friday afternoon. The caterer, obviously, was gone. Danny told me, with a look on his face that was trying very hard not to be pleased and failing completely, that Robert's mother had called 3 other catering companies in the county, and all 3 had politely declined. Because Danny, it turned out, wasn't the only man in town who considered me a friend worth being loyal to. The florist situation resolved itself with a significant, last-minute markup that I later heard reached nearly triple the original quote, paid, presumably, by the Ashfords themselves, since there was no longer a Pierce checkbook standing behind any of it. And the string quartet Claire had specifically requested, the one I'd paid a deposit for 8 months earlier, simply didn't show, because the deposit had never actually transferred and nobody on the Ashford side had thought to confirm it directly. I want to be clear with you about something, because I think it matters. I did not do any of this to sabotage my daughter's wedding day. I did not make a single phone call with malice in my heart, and I never once contacted a vendor to tell them not to work with her. What I did was far simpler, and in some ways far more devastating than any act of active revenge could have been. I simply stopped standing behind a life I had been quietly financing for years, and I let my daughter and her new family discover, in real time, exactly how much of what they'd taken for granted had actually been resting on my shoulders the entire time. The wedding happened anyway, from what I understand, in a smaller banquet room at a hotel near the interstate with a caterer brought in from Columbus at considerable expense, and I'm told Robert's father did in fact walk Claire down the aisle exactly as she'd requested in that text message 4 days earlier. I wasn't there to see it. I spent that Saturday exactly where I'd spent nearly every Saturday of my adult life, out in the far field, checking fence lines that didn't need checking, because my hands needed something honest to do while the rest of the world went on without me in it. It was almost 3 weeks before Claire finally called. I remember the date because it was a Tuesday, the same day of the week the original text had arrived, and I remember thinking, when I saw her name light up my phone screen, that there was something almost cruel about the symmetry of it. I let it ring twice before I answered, not out of spite, but because some part of me needed those 2 rings to prepare myself for whatever was coming. She was crying before I even said hello. She told me the wedding had been a disaster, that half the guests had complained about the hotel's cramped banquet room, that Robert's parents had spent the entire reception in hushed, furious conversations with each other, that the financial pressure of covering costs they'd never planned to cover had created a rift between Robert and his own father that showed no sign of healing. And then, somewhere in the middle of all of it, she asked me, in a voice that sounded very much like the 9-year-old girl who used to hide notes in my lunch pail, why I had done what I did. I told her the truth. I told her that I hadn't sabotaged her wedding. I told her that a family doesn't get to decide, over a text message, who belongs inside it and who doesn't, and then still expect that same excluded person to keep quietly paying the bills for the family that excluded him. I told her that love isn't a bank account you can draw from indefinitely while denying the person on the other end of the withdrawal a seat at your table. I told her that what she'd sent me that Tuesday morning wasn't just a change of wedding plans. It was a decision about who her family was, and I had simply, finally, respected that decision by stepping fully outside of it. She asked, quietly, if there was any way back. I told her the truth about that too. I told her about the $25,000 sitting in trust, untouched, waiting for 5 years to pass. Not because I was angling for reconciliation, but because some part of me still hoped she'd become, one day, a woman worth walking that door back open for. I told her that everything else, the farmhouse, the mineral rights, the foundation now bearing her late mother's name, was gone for good, not out of cruelty, but because a man my age doesn't get unlimited chances to learn the same lesson twice. We didn't resolve everything on that call. I don't think grief this large resolves itself in a single conversation, and I've stopped expecting it to. But we talked for nearly 2 hours, longer than we'd spoken in the 8 months leading up to that Tuesday text message. And toward the end of it, she asked if she could come by the farmhouse sometime soon, just to talk, just to sit at the kitchen table the way we used to before Robert, before the Ashfords, before any of it. I told her the door was open. I meant it plainly, the way I mean most things, and I hung up the phone and walked out to the porch, where Ellen's rocking chair still sits exactly where it's always sat, and I looked out over 200 acres of land that no longer belonged to anyone but a foundation built in her mother's memory. Land that would put some other family's daughter through college on the same kind of quiet, unspoken love that I'd once given freely and without condition. I've thought a great deal, in the months since, about what I'd say to any parent sitting where I was sitting that Tuesday morning, iron in hand, reading a text message that rewrites, in a single sentence, everything you believed your family meant. I would tell them what I've come to understand as the truest thing I know. Love your children with everything you have, but never let that love become a leash they can use to walk you out of your own life whenever it becomes convenient. Give generously, but give with your eyes open, and understand that real family isn't the name on a wedding invitation. It's the people who show up again and again without needing to be reminded of everything you've already given them. I am not the same man I was before that text message arrived. I'm quieter now, more careful with what I offer and to whom I offer it. But I'm also, for the first time in longer than I can remember, entirely at peace with the shape of my own life. If you've ever had to make a hard choice to protect what's left of your dignity after a child tried to take it from you, I want to hear about it in the comments below, because I promise you, you are far from alone in this. And there is a strange, quiet freedom waiting on the other side of finally choosing yourself. Subscribe if this story meant something to you, and I'll see you in the next one.